we definitely have our work cut out for us over the next few months. I think this might be the most challenging part of the conference, tying everything together, because there's just simply a lot to tie together. But I am going to try and summarize, I think, some of the clearer, bigger takeaways that I've got over the last couple of days. As a starting point, clearly there is a need for more research, especially on the effectiveness of trade and investment, implements and rules in reducing modern slavery risks. What has become more apparent over the last 2 days, and possibly more today than yesterday, is that there will need to be different approaches for investment as from what we might have from trade. There is much less lack of clarity on the link between trade and investment on the one hand and modern slavery. That, I think, we generally agree that there is a link, even if we just put it or try and put it as simply as supply as being part of a larger supply chain. And for investment, we still have to answer the question of whether an international approach or multilateral approach is desirable or even possible, especially because states cannot even agree on a multilateral investment treaty of general application. And so for us to then make a push for a multilateral investment treaty that accounts for modern slavery risks, that reminds us of one of the quotes I had yesterday from the Director General of the WTO, having ambitious but realistic goals, especially if we're seeking international reform. Sticking with the WTO can be quite complex, especially given the artificial split between the WTO as an institution and the WTO as the members. One of the conversations I had with a lawyer at the WTO while preparing for this conference was we should not be asking the WTO as an institution about forced labor. We should take that back to the members, which I got back to them and said, well, we have representatives of at least 3 members, the US, the UK, and EU coming to the conference. So we have sort of taken account of that. And what makes that a bit more interesting, at least for me, is that we do have the WTO as an institution for trade, but we do not have a similar institution for investment. So it means that in terms of trade, at least we have an arena that we can go to and effectively make our case to the members of the WTO, or whether to the WTO as an institution, but we do not have a similar one for investment. The other thing that I think we need to study a bit more is, and again, as Jasmine has just pointed out, the issue with import bans. Strictly speaking, as we saw yesterday, and I think touched on a bit today, import bans are not, strictly speaking, legal under the WTO agreements. But because they have not been challenged by any country by any member that has been affected by them, we do not have an actual interpretation for us to decide, or for us to clearly agree that they are a contravention of trade rules. And I could go into a lengthy discussion of why that is an issue, but I will spare everyone the details, because that is one topic I absolutely geek out on. So I could talk until the cows come home. But we know that, although of course there is that lack of clarity, we know that so far import bans are effective. So they may not necessarily be, strictly speaking, legal, but they are effective. And we saw yesterday a very useful evaluation of the top glove experience. And of course, their effectiveness is not just in the sense that they can be tracked and monitored or measured by the states that are applying them, but they also compel producers, investors, and so on to make sure that they are compliant if they want to access certain markets. And as we saw from yesterday, I think it's about 56 or 58 current or with withholding orders in place in the US. So there is at least some effectiveness there. And then there is also one thing I've noted is that there is some kind of disparity in business attitudes, and I'll try and explain this. If you remember from yesterday's presentation from Top Glove, from Melissa at Top Glove, you could tell that there was a strong interest by at least Top Glove as a company, as an investor, to basically put their house in order. And similar approaches today while looking at the Thai Stock Exchange and investor attitudes. But when it comes now back to the UK, especially, there seems to be a stronger interest in protecting reputation and avoiding any links to modern slavery, or if at the risk of sounding political, or avoiding accountability, which it appears to be investors and businesses in other areas are more willing to do in spite of the reputation to damage. And this was something that both Melissa and I believe it was Kate yesterday mentioned, that Top Glove is still having to recover from the damage to their reputation on the basis of all the good that they've had to do, because effectively putting their house in order involves admitting that it was out of order to start. There is also a need for clearer, stronger regulation on migrant workers' rights. That, of course, was made very clear, especially by the story from our survivor yesterday, which was a heart-wrenching story to listen to. But even from other presentations, including the Top Glove experience from Katrina's presentation this afternoon, there is clearly a lot of forced labor and modern slavery risk involved with migrant workers, whether because they do not have awareness of their rights, or whether simply, as we saw yesterday, the domestic laws relating to migrant workers might not be appropriate or sufficient in controlling or preventing modern slavery risk. There is also, and this is perhaps something that is very notorious in the field of international law, there is a thin line between the need to prevent modern slavery risks and the extraterritorial application of rules. Of course, the UFLPA is one is one of those examples where we have, of course, the US passing a law that then has effectively an effect on another country's domestic affairs. And that I know is something that international law generally grapples with, just being able to maintain that balance between the sovereignty of other states, but also achieving greater good, greater ideals by the use of our own domestic laws. And then something that became more apparent today, especially while looking at modern slavery from an investment perspective, is the question of who bears of reforms, prevention, remediation, and all that. We saw yesterday that Top Glove had to spend millions in remediation alone. Does that cost then get transferred on to the final consumer? Does it come out of the investors' profits? All those are questions that we need, I think, to reflect on and consider. And as Jeffrey has just pointed out, there are, of course, mixed views on sharing of information. We saw the US approach yesterday when Eric told us about how open, how readily available information is, whether for importers or the general public, the civil society, and so on. But in the EU and the UK, the approach is different, where it seems to be very closely guarded. And then, of course, there is that significant and understandable overlap between trade and other areas, especially human rights and labor laws. And of course, finally, there is that there are blurry lines between modern slavery law and practice on the one hand and domestic laws, which, as I said, again, going back to the top left example, we might have compliance with domestic laws, but where those domestic laws are in fact ineffective or inappropriate for preventing modern slavery from an international perspective, those laws might as well not exist. There's a lot more that I could say, but I don't want to hog the limelight, so to speak.